The Geary Act had two purposes. One was further exclusion of the Chinese, and the second was the expulsion, right, or deportation of the Chinese already living in the United States. And the manner in which they did this was by imposing what may be termed an internal passport system. So the the federal and the state governments had the power to basically go up to someone who looked like Chinese and demanded to see if they have the proper papers. So, any police officer or immigration officer could approach you and demand that you demonstrate that you are here in this country legally. And if you happen to not carry with you those proper documents, then you were subjected to deportation. And that's what the 1893 Feng Yue Ting case was all about. That basically has contested the constitutionality of the 1892 Geary Act because Chinese persons were being deported because they did not, at the time, possess with them these documentations.
I have a question. So then, would that be relevant to now, like what ICE is doing and like the immigration right now? And so if that act, like you're saying, the 1983 act, like does that do anything for now, or is it kind of only like geared towards the Chinese and that's why?
Absolutely not. It's not just simply geared toward the Chinese. It has a tremendous sort of relevance today. In fact, I gave a presentation here at CSU comparing and contrasting the Geary Act and SB 1070. I don't know if you are familiar with SB 1070, but the Senate Bill 1070 that was passed in the state of Arizona, that basically does the same thing. It compels police officers and government workers the power to basically approach anybody who looks suspicious or who appears to be in the United States unlawfully.
I was just going to say, the paper that I'm writing for the reflection this week is actually on how I wasn't doing the Geary Act, but the Chinese Exclusion Act, and how it is like the first act that supported all of the other immigration acts after it. So like, I really love how you said how ICE operates in the country and how this act can kind of be the basis for that. But there's so many other like things that have happened in the United States in the past like decade, like the Muslim ban that happened, things like that. Like there are not very many like laws or acts or like movements in the country that have like intentionally expelled people based on either their like religion or race or ethnicity, but this was the first one. So it essentially acted as like the basis for what you should do if you're going to do those again. So
the fact that the Chinese were singled out for both exclusion and also deportation, they were named in terms of their ethnic identity, but also it was tied to their racial identity as well. And it set a very bad precedent in terms of the immigration history in the United States. The same principle had applied to a number of other groups throughout history and in contemporary period as well. How we are now targeting certain people from sort of Muslim countries is an extension of history. That was not an aberration, but it was an extension of prior practices that had applied to the Chinese and other sort of populations throughout American history. So, I think those are important connections for us to make, and that we should not lose sight of history because history informs so many things about what is happening today. Also, I wanted to say something about this, relevance of race here as well. A lot of the people, the Chinese in the 19th century who were picked up off the streets and were demanded to see their identifications was all based on racial profiling. And, we talk about brown or black while driving. Well, Chinese person walking the streets of San Francisco could be easily picked up by police officers in the 19th century. And they could have been demanded to see their identifications as well. What was sort of compounding these issues was that at that time, the Chinese Americans and other Asians in America more broadly were excluded from citizenship. Citizenship policy of that time period was based on the 1790 law, right, Naturalization Act, that prohibited people who were non-whites from becoming citizens of the United States. That made it really difficult for the Chinese persons to not just simply get American citizenship, but it became a basis for all sorts of exclusion and discrimination. Let me try to turn the clock a little bit backwards, and maybe we could talk a little bit about the context leading up to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and then, of course, 1892 Geary Act. Some of the key issues that were developing in the 1860s, right? We had just completed the Civil War, and we had passed a series of 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and also the Burlingame Treaty of 1868. So those were really sort of positive developments that had happened throughout the 1860s. But we recognized that as we entered the 1870s, there were some issues that challenged some of these positive developments that had happened in the prior decade, right? So what were some of the things that happened in the 1870s that would eventually lead to the passage of the Congressional Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882? Something must have happened in the 1870s. What are some of the key events that you think may have triggered the anti-Chinese sentiment to such a point where people felt compelled to pass a congressional law to exclude the Chinese? There's a broad sort of political developments that happened during that time period. The Reconstruction period is immediately after the end of the Civil War in 1865, right, to more or less like a little over a decade, right, into the middle part of the 1870s, right, during which time we as a society were trying to sort of reconfigure the social and political and economic systems, right, that were devastated by not only the Civil War, but we wanted to also break away from the tradition of slavery system that had engulfed our society for many, many years. So we needed to reconfigure, refashion a new social economic sort of norm, right? So there was a lot of political sort of debates around how we were going to do that, right? In the midst of these debates, right, the Chinese labor question emerged as one of many sort of political topics that had developed during that time period. So we, I think, talked about last time some of the ordinances that were passed in the city and county of San Francisco in the 1870s. And these ordinances were tantamount to what might be referred to as nuisance ordinances. What that basically means is that city supervisors and politicians were passing these laws that would really sort of make it difficult for the Chinese to settle and become thick in American society. Right? These were pesky nuisance ordinances that really made it difficult for the Chinese people to adapt to life here in the United States, including the basket carrying ordinance, the lodging house ordinance, the practice of shearing off or cutting off the queue, the long hair, braided hair of the Chinese people, and preventing the Chinese from sending back to China their human remains after a person dies, right? These were really important like cultural practices that the Chinese, overseas Chinese persons still kind of retained and practiced in San Francisco and other parts of the world. So by passing these ordinances, they were hoping that these will prevent future sort of immigrants from China from coming into the United States and also to kick some of them out. A lot of these nuisance ordinances were passed with the aim of maintaining order and public safety, health and safety sort of issues. And so they were constitutionally upheld. But some of these were challenged in California Supreme Court and also went to the US Supreme Court as well. and they were overturned based on the idea that they were selectively applying, right, enforcing these laws to the Chinese persons, right? So selective enforcement of laws, or selective enforcement of racially sort of neutral laws, was still considered unconstitutional. Many of the Chinese persons then basically challenged these ordinances by taking the city and the state to Supreme Courts, right? So that's an important fact for us to remember as well. In the middle of 1875, there was a federal law. This was not a state law, but a federal congressional act, one of the first sort of immigration laws that was passed. And it is known as the Page Law of 1875, right? And this was basically an anti-prostitution law, but it would have a deleterious impact on the ability of Chinese women from coming into the United States. Page Law basically was an immigration law that prohibited prostitutes from coming into the United States, right? Which I think makes sense to a certain extent, does it not? We don't want, for a variety of reasons, people engaged in illicit sort of activities. We don't want drug, traffickers. We don't want criminals. We don't want other people who are not upstanding citizens. And prostitution at this time in the 19th century was considered illicit trade. Federal immigration law basically prohibited prostitutes from coming into the United States. But you have to really think through how this law may have been implemented. So if you were an American official trying to implement anti-prostitution immigration law, how does that work?
I feel like you would just have to say any woman who wasn't married was a prostitute, like, because there's no way you can really know, especially with sex trafficking going on, human trafficking. So I feel like that's what they would have done.
And there would be a lot of people, wouldn't it? Right? So, I mean, that's a really great point, isn't it? How do these American officials know if someone who's coming into the United States is a prostitute? Do you think that the immigrants themselves would say, oh, yes, I'm a prostitute and I would like to go to the United States? Do you think they would say that on their applications? So there must have been some sort of connection made, right, between a particular ethnic population and ascribing them with the idea that, they will likely be prostitutes, if not already prostitutes, right? So there was a social perception that the Chinese women were prostitutes. And of course, this is ridiculous because prostitution is widely practiced in all countries. It's not unique to the Chinese. People from all ethnic backgrounds engaged in prostitution. It wasn't just simply the Chinese woman, but the perception was very different. The perception was that the Chinese women were engaged in prostitution, and they will likely engage in prostitution even if they were not. And so the immigration officers basically prohibited Chinese women from coming into the United States, even though the 1875 Page Law did not specify Chinese women. So this is another example of selective enforcement of law. And this will have there's an interlacing of racialized system and gendered system here, right? And so for a long period of time, Chinese women in particular could not become citizens because their citizenship status depended on the status of their husbands. And this law had been in practice well into the 20th century. And so there was a sort of hierarchical system of citizenship for women that applied differently based on race. In the 1920s, when we passed the 19th Amendment, and also the Citizenship Rights Act for the women in this country, it had only applied to white women, and it did not apply to women of color. And it would have a sort of complicated outcome for men of color too, right? So wasn't an even process in terms of how people were able to gain access to privileges and rights in terms of race and gender. From the vantage point of the Chinese woman in this country, I think that it would have been very difficult, not just simply to immigrate into the United States, but upon arriving here, their lives would be very different than a lot of other sort of ethnic populations because of the smallness of their numbers and the various sort of discriminatory laws and practices that had applied to the Chinese women, very, somewhat differently than the Chinese men. I wanted to share with you this. I want you to take a moment to look at this drawing and see what kind of stands out for you, right? Take a moment to read sign the symbols and the writings and what the dominant sort of message is here. One of the hints that I can provide is that this provides some clues as to why we were able to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Okay, I want you to take a look.
I think what stood out to me was the two scopes, the capitalist one and the working, I think it said working force. I'm not sure. There was one that said
It just
working.
simply said working, yeah. So there was a
Yeah,
capitalist, there were telescopes, right? That read
right,
capitalist. Also the press, working. Anything else that stood
right.
out for you? Any writings?
I couldn't quite, like, the quality wasn't that great, but it looked like the big sign on the side was saying, like, there's like a Chinese meeting where they're going to talk about how Europeans knew nothing, like don't know anything. I think that's what I read.
So
I thought it was very
European
interesting.
know nothing, know nothing.
Yeah,
And then there was
yeah.
a Chinese,
And then trade unions are also mentioned on
yeah,
there.
the trades union,
Mhm.
right? Okay, so there was something about the Chinese labor question. And then there was something about the European know nothing. Has anybody heard of the European Know Nothing? It was actually a political party known as the Know Nothing Party. It was originally called the American Party, also known as the Know Nothing Party. And these were politicians whose political platform was explicitly anti-Catholic and anti-Chinese. And they would engage in all kinds of anti-Catholic and anti-Chinese campaigns, propaganda, activities. And when the media or the press would approach them and ask them questions about, do you know anything about, such and such sort of movement or gathering or propaganda that are anti-Chinese or anti-Catholic? And their responses would always be, I know nothing. That's how they came to be known as the Know Nothing Party.
Kind of going back to the telescopes, I think it's very interesting the role that capitalism plays. Kind of just, well, our government was really founded more for business than anything else and for enterprise. And I think we forget that a lot because that's not the common narrative. But it's very interesting how slavery was a system of labor, and the reasons a lot of like the North were anti-slavery was because slaves were taking jobs away from white people. That's again not something that's super taught, and it's interesting that the large part of the anti-Chinese immigration was because again they're taking jobs away from white people. So I think it's very interesting, kind of how like the role of white labor and how this plays into like basically every aspect of our government in the past and also today.
Yeah. So here's an important lesson. The the pitting of different ethnic and racial populations against each other, based on economic interests. We see that play out all the time. So, African slaves pitted against poor white working class, for instance. So over economic interests. The capitalists essentially were driving wedge between different ethnic and racial populations over economic interests. That theme is consistent, right, throughout American history. And it still, right, plays out in present context as well. The first sort of anti-Chinese movement occurred precisely because of this practice of driving wedge between different ethnic populations. And let me demonstrate how that happened. Let me just scroll through a couple more slides, right? So you can see here that this comet looking thing that is screeching across the darkened sky here. It has some letters, right? Some words written on it. It says cheap labor. And this figure is actually quite reminiscent of the Chinese persons who wear this long queue during this time period. The title of this painting is called The Comet of Chinese Labor. If you look at the rest of the sort of drawings here, there's a lot of people that are gathered here, right? A lot of the businessmen, people representing the press, the capitalists, the working, and the politicians here. The working here represents what is known as the Workingmen's Party of America. They represent the trade unions that had been formed just a few years earlier. And they're gathered here. It looks like this is a Capitol dorm. There are churches, right? There are factory stacks, and they even brought women and children to witness the arrival and the anticipation of the arrival of this cheap Chinese labor. Now, what was the political context of this? There was a strike that had occurred in 1870 in North Adams, Massachusetts, right? This is the height of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And 1870 is a very important year because it's 1 year after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad that the Chinese laborers helped to construct. So in 1870, there was a sort of massive strike led by mostly Irish workers in this factory. They were striking and protesting against low wages and the introduction of labor eliminating sort of machines, right? And the workers in that factory and thousands of other factories in northeastern seaboard states like Massachusetts, Boston area in particular, all the way down to New York and Pennsylvania. Now, what ended up happening was that the owner of this model shoe factory decided to utilize this ethnic antagonism, right, by pitting one ethnic group against another. So during this time period, most of the workers were Irish workers. Now, Calvin Sampson decided to pit Irish workers against the Chinese workers, utilizing and highlighting the ethnic differences as a way of suppressing the labor rights movement of this time period. And how did he do this? He did this by importing 75 Chinese workers from San Francisco, most likely on the Transcontinental Railroad that they helped to construct and complete just 1 year prior. Sampson then decided to do was basically, pit the Irish workers against the Chinese by bringing in 75 Chinese from the West Coast. One of the questions that I would like to raise to class is not only why Sampson would do this, and second, how effective do you think such a strategy was in terms of breaking the back of these striking workers, not only in his factory, but, there were thousands of other, factory owners and working class men, the press and the politicians were watching with a great anticipation, the arrival of the 75 Chinese workers to Sampson's shoe factory. So this was a really sort of heavily anticipated event. And the question to all of you is, why was this, such a major event, do you think? It was just a 75 Chinese workers. It wasn't 75,000 Chinese workers.
So I think it was a huge event, well, partially because a lot of the Chinese immigrants were going to the West Coast first. So like New York obviously does have like a Chinese population, but it probably wasn't as thriving then at that point. The labor shift probably moved a lot of the Chinese immigrants over there. But it's a big deal because if it works, then every other factory can do the same thing and therefore hire cheaper labor. And all the groups that go on strike, bringing in the Chinese and being like, oh, they work so hard and they don't complain and I can pay them way less. Like those workers are going to be out of a job and they're eventually going to have to come back and accept lower wages. And I mean, it's very successful. The only place where it didn't really work was Hawaii. That was like the exception, and it worked like everywhere else.
If the Irish workers and the Chinese workers did not get along as Samson had anticipated, if the ethnic differences and the racial differences were too much for them to too much for the workers to overcome over their common economic interest, right? Because if you think about it, right, the Irish workers were poor, black workers were poor, the Chinese workers were poor. They all had common economic interest. Wouldn't you agree? But they were divided. Their economic interest, right, fell to the wayside because of the fact that there was a greater cultural, ethnic, and racial differences that were highlighted. And Samson was counting on using race and ethnicity as a way to sort of drive that wedge between these populations who had shared the common economic interest. So this was a test case, right? Samson was trying out, right, whether or not this ethnic division strategy would work. And the workers fell right into the hands of the capitalists, right? The likes of Samson. They couldn't bond together around economic class solidarity because of the sentiments around anti-Chinese trumped everything else, which is a very important, I think, historical lesson. I think in today's sort of context as well, I mean, we succumb to ethnic and racial differences at the expense of economic interests. I mean, you don't have to be a Marxist to kind of espouse these ideas because, you know, people are poor regardless of your color, regardless of your ethnicity. We have a difficult time wrapping our heads around coming together around economic interests and overcoming ethnic or racial differences. What this informs us is that the factor of race and ethnicity throughout history has been so huge, and we are unable to transcend that in order to achieve a greater sort of economic justice in this country. So what is the outcome of bringing in 75 Chinese workers to this model shoe factory in North Adams, Massachusetts? Well, the labor groups, they needed to hold an emergency meeting. The European know-nothings were alarmed by it because, you know, they're going to bring Chinese in their midst. So they're kind of alarmed by this. But also the Workingmen's Party of America were, you know, threatened by the arrival of Chinese labor. Their responses could have been multiple. You know, one is to drive the Chinese out, which is exactly what would happen in history. There could have been other options. If you were Irish workers and if you had sort of witnessed the arrival of the Chinese, what might have been like an alternative scenario other than exclusion of the Chinese? Do you think that it would have been possible for the Irish workers to embrace the Chinese and to organize them by overcoming ethnic differences, seeing them as their equals, because they share common economic interest? What if the Irish workers had embraced them into the rank and file of their unions, rather than saying, oh, you're Chinese, you can't join the union? Then they would have had a consolidated, they would have had this kind of united front against the capitalist class. But instead, they were divided. And there was always this reserve army of Chinese labor who could be utilized on a moment's notice, because we now have the transcontinental railroad that could come to eastern seaboard states in a matter of a couple of days. And thousands of Chinese laborers could have been on that train to East Coast. And what was really absolutely critical was the manner in which labor unions responded to the arrival of the Chinese. It's unfortunate, but it's an important lesson, I think, where we could not overcome racial and ethnic differences. We had, you know, common interest, but we were unable to overcome these racial and ethnic differences to bring about a much more solid and united economic front against the capitalist interests. So that was a historical lesson. I mean, there are other slides that I wanted to share with you today, but in the interest of time, we are already out of time. I guess I'll post the slides And let's see if you have additional questions. We do have to kind of move on, right? Because we have to talk about developments in Hawaii as well on Thursday. So I'll bring to these issues to closure first half of the class next time we meet on Thursday, and then we'll move on to Asians in Hawaii. All right, that's it for today. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you on Thursday.